Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth, Yeshua, Messianic Synagogue. This is our midweek Torah study when we dig into the Torah and read about this from the current parsha. This is a broadcast from our home, recorded in our home. So welcome. We do these midweek Torah teachings and Torah studies, Torah discussions for your benefit. And if you would like to go further with any of these discussions, if you'd like to explore this further, by all means reach out to me. You'll find my email address listed below in the description of the video. If you would like to, you can subscribe to our channel. This will get you notifications whenever we release a new video. And then you can stay up to speed with us and keep up with us. If you would like to support this ministry, you'll find instructions to support this ministry in the description below. Okay, without further delay or confusion, let's begin. This week's parsha is Bereshit, from Bereshit. It is about Vayechi. He lived. It is coming from Genesis, Bereshit, chapter 47, verse 28 through the end of Bereshit. This is the last parsha in Bereshit, in Genesis, and so we have reached the conclusion of the first book of Genesis, of the Torah, Genesis of the Torah. So what we start is chapter 47, and it starts midway through chapter 47, a little bit towards the end. In the previous parsha, we had a statement here, verse 27. Israel lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. In the next parsha, next verse, we have this: Yaakov lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. Thus, Yaakov lived to be 147 years. And you can discuss this sort of duplicate sort of contrast in the text here, this idea that first we're going to call him Israel, living in the land of Egypt 17 years, then you call him Yaakov, living in the land of Egypt 17 years. For me, what I'd like to point out to you is that Jacob is the last of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that in the next book, in Shemot, Adonai reintroduces himself to the people, to his chosen people, and he reintroduces himself as God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember, Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and yet we still have references to Jacob's name. So why would this be? Why would we have Jacob's name being changed to Israel, but then we have Jacob? And then here, in this place, we see it's back-to-back verses. First we have Israel living in the land of Egypt 17 years, and Jacob living in the land of Egypt 17 years. And I think what it does is, for me, it speaks to this sort of pivot point of Jacob, of the closing of the epoch of the patriarchs, which is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and how they were unique in all the earth. Unique in the sense of Adonai's choice of them and his grace that he poured out to them that sustained them, and also unique in their response to him in that day, and they remain pillars in our faith and paragons of our faith in the way that they responded to Adonai. One thing that has to be discussed is that Adonai always gives grace to each generation according to that generation. We have a special grace given to our generation because of what we're living through in these days. That Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had a grace as well, that Adonai sustained them in order to accomplish his plan. One of the ways that you can describe grace is Adonai preserving his plan in your life in spite of you. Let me say that again. One of the definitions of grace is Adonai preserving his plan in your life in spite of you. Carrying out his promises and executing his perfect will in your life according to his word, which you would then see the fruit and the harvest thereof, but honestly acknowledging that it came about in spite of your humanity and failure. So there was absolutely a grace here. in the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, such that Adonai sustained his plan through them to begin to interact with humanity based on these covenants and promises, which then made their fulfillment first in Yeshua, and then in Yeshua in us, and will be ultimately satisfied and fulfilled with the restoration of all of Israel, and with the kingdom of God in unity as a singular bride, and then, of course, the resurrection of the earth, and then eternity with Him. So this is kind of the trajectory, if you will, the timeline of human history, and it began, of course, in the garden, but it took some significant steps forward in resolving this in the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But it says here, Israel lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. Israel referring to Jacob, the beginning of Israel, the people of Israel, and the people of his generation, the Toledot of him. All right, it says that Jacob lived to be 147 years old, and this sets up this little narrative of the end of Jacob's life, and he is passing in Egypt, putting him out of step with the other two patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac. And he has this remarkable statement here. He says to Joseph, put your hand under my thigh. Lots of conjecture about the purpose of such a statement. Why would Jacob say such a thing? Probably strikes us as a little odd and arcane. But let's look at it with open minds and open eyes and see what there is to see. One of the statement is that it refers to a person who is sitting, because how else are you going to put your hand under somebody's thigh unless they're sitting down and you put your hand under their thigh. The seated person is by virtue of, put your hand under my thigh, this sort of symbolic act. The seated person is capturing the future obedience of the person who's going to enter into this covenant. He's capturing the future obedience by sitting on his hand. It's in effect, you're here, you're bound to me in this place, and so forth. But another linguistic understanding of this passage is fascinating. In multiple cultures and languages throughout history, there is a connection between, in phonetic and linguistic connections between seed, referring to seminal seed, of course, and witnesses. The future seed being witnesses of the covenant, or witnesses of the decisions made, the legacy, the heritage made by a forefather. In that you can see the legacy, the heritage of a forefather in his children and grandchildren and descendants. All right, so in multiple languages there are phonetic and linguistic connections between this idea of seed and this idea of witnesses. Future seed being witnesses of the covenants that were made amongst the forefathers. Notice that Abraham had the same instruction to his servant when the servant was instructed to find a wife for Isaac. Notice that the servant is likewise told, place your hand under my thigh. Euphemistically, what's happening here is that you could understand this in a sense that he is swearing upon his seed by putting his hand close to his seed. Put your hand under my thigh, close to my loins, if you will, and close to my seed, and swear upon my future seed that your future actions will guarantee my future seed. This is what this could mean, and this begins to make complete sense in the narrative of Abraham, because of course Abraham was sending out his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac. Absolutely imperative if Adonai's promise and covenant is going to be completed in Isaac, which of course it has to be, because Isaac was just delivered from the sacrifice. Abraham gave up his son in the Akedah, and then to be sacrificed on the mountain, and of course Adonai stepped in and refused Isaac as a sacrifice. Therefore, there's nothing left for Isaac but to go and bear children in order to fulfill the first half of this covenant with Adonai. He's going to give you descendants and land. Well, you're not going to get descendants and land. You're not going to get descendants unless Isaac has a bride. And so the servant now is given this imperative to go on this commission and find a bride for Isaac. And in doing this, Abraham says to him, "Put your hand under my thigh," euphemistically saying, "Swear upon my seed, putting your hand close to my seed, swear on my future seed that your future actions will guarantee my future seed." So that would explain, we understand that conjecture as it applies in Abraham. So what's happening here in that Joseph is being told to put his hand under Jacob's thigh? And what it is Jacob is asking to be buried with his fathers in Canaan, in the cave of Machpelah. To the consistency of the claim on the land. Remember, this sort of field of Machpelah is an outpost of occupation and ownership. It's sort of a down payment declaration serving notice and witness to future generations that this is going to be the land of Israel as guaranteed by Adonai to be given to the children of Abraham. This is what Adonai had promised. And so this field is sort of the witness post, if you will, of that future guarantee. So we have a lot of things happening about the future. It would be untenable for Jacob at this point to be buried in Egypt. He shouldn't be buried in Egypt. He should carry on that consistent sort of claim on the land. Bear in mind that for the next couple hundred years, the children of Israel are going to be in Egypt. And if Jacob is buried in Egypt, then it makes a statement that we have turned a corner and we're no longer considering ourselves people of the land of Canaan. We're now considered people of Egypt. Whether or not we are sojourners here doesn't really matter. We've kind of given up our claim on the land of Canaan because Jacob was buried in Egypt. And Jacob, I think, is pushing back against this, saying, "No, I'm not going to be buried in Egypt. You need to bury me in Canaan, the land of Israel." Because these two covenants are tied together. The covenant, the promise of descendants, and the covenant or promise of land. These two things are tied together. You're not going to have Israel descendants without Israel land. You're not going to have Israel land without Israel descendants. This is what's so important that we understand during this day when we're trying to clean up the mess of 2,000 years of bifurcated history, in that the Christians and the Jews went separate ways, and the Jews forsook all claim and blessing upon Yeshua and surrendered Yeshua and the gospel and the high ground of the gospel to the Christians, and any Jews who did accept Yeshua were swept into the Gentile camp and forsook their Jewish identity, which is just all wrong. Do you see now how all wrong this all is? You don't have Israel, the people, without Israel, the land. The land was restored, the people are restored. Now we need to work to restore this schism between the Gentiles and the Jews. All right. So it would be a statement of unbelief for Jacob to be buried in Egypt. It would be faithlessness for Jacob to be buried in Egypt, because it would be abandoning the covenant of the land and the descendants, because they are bound together. And now you just become an ethnic group, a people known by Father and not known by this covenant with Adonai. All of this is untenable. Adonai has invested too much. And so we have in this moment here, place your hand under my thigh. All right. So Joseph agrees to that. I will do as you said. Swear it to me, swear it to him. And then it says this: Israel bowed down at the head of his bed. All right, so that's all fine and good. A while later, and this for me is really funny. First line of chapter 48 says, "A while later." Remember when Isaac thought that his time had come near, and his eyes were dim, and he called for Esau, and he said, "Go and fetch me some game from the field, and I will bless you." And the idea being this is the final blessing, and both Rebekah and Jacob jump into action in order to, quote unquote, save the plan of Adonai, Jacob being the Bechor, not Esau. And so we had to figure out how to get Jacob, back into the blessing. Esau has already abandoned the birthright. We've got nothing to lose here. This is probably a no-brainer. Let's just get this done. And so Rebecca and Yaakov enter into this. And this is at the moment when Isaac is saying, I'm old and my eyes are dim. Well, Isaac doesn't die. In fact, Isaac lives for a very long time after this. In fact, Isaac is still alive when Jacob comes back after spending some 20 to 40 years under Laban. So what happened here that Isaac thought he was going to die? Well, we've got an interesting thing here in chapter 47 of Vayechi, where it says this: Yaakov lived some 17 years old. The time came when Israel was approaching death, and so he called for Joseph. And then it says a while later. So once again, that we've got this sort of okay, he's going to die, but then he doesn't quite die. He's going to be around a little bit longer. Somebody tells Joseph. So Joseph takes his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Yaakov was told, here comes your son Joseph. Israel gathers his strength and sits up in bed. Yaakov says to Yosef, El Shaddai appeared to me at Luz and blessed me. I'll make you fruitful and numerous. I'll make you a group of peoples, and I will give you this land. He is repeating this covenant, this statement, this promise. It's about the descendants and about the land, and so forth. And he says this: now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. What a fascinating statement. Jacob is saying that Joseph's two sons that were born in Egypt are mine. When do we recall somebody else saying, your children are mine? Anyone? Raise your hand in the back. Yes, of course, it's Laban. Jacob goes to his wives in the field and says, Adonai has called me to go return to the land of my fathers, and they agree to go with him. And so they in the dead of night, they get ready and they leave and they sneak away, and it takes Laban a week or so to catch up with them, and they finally catch up with them. Okay. And at that meeting, when Laban is caught up with them because they were trying to run away and flee, Laban makes this incredible statement. He says, your wives are mine and your children are mine. They're all mine. It's all mine. And here we have Jacob at the end of his life saying, your sons are mine. What's happening here? What do we see happening here? And this is what I see, is I see Laban as a type of the anti-Messiah or anti-Adonai, if you want to call it that. Because the people of Israel belong to Adonai. The 12 tribes belong to Adonai. They are his people. And Laban had no claim upon them. And here, it's almost as if Jacob, acting as Israel, acting as Adonai, is acting on behalf of Adonai, who says, your sons are mine. And bear in mind also that we've got this sort of tension in the text where Joseph has entirely invested himself into Egypt. Remember, he says, Adonai has caused me to forget my labors and the troubles of my father's house. And so Joseph was all in the house of Pharaoh and stood before Pharaoh almost as a son. And so if Joseph is Pharaoh's son, then who are Ephraim and Manasseh? Well, they are Pharaoh's sons. But they can't be, because they are of the 12 tribes plus the Levites. They're of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so there is a reasserting of ownership here and identity here. And it says this in the text, point blank, Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, as much mine as Reuben and Shimon are. So the first two are like the first two, Reuben and Shimon being the first two born of Leah, of Jacob, and Ephraim and Manasseh being the first two that were born of Joseph. The children born after to you after them will be yours, but for purposes of inheritance, they're to be counted with their older brothers. Okay. Now, as for me, when I came to Padan, Rachel died suddenly as we were traveling through the land of Canaan while we were still some distance from Ephrat. So I buried her there on the way to Ephrat, also known as Bethlehem. Why is this here? What is the meaning of putting this in the text here? It's unnecessary at first glance. What is Jacob doing referring to his wife who passed? He's referring previously to this to Reuben and Shimon as being as much his sons as Ephraim and Manasseh. So there wouldn't be a connection to Rachel in that statement. Why did this come up here? And I think we have to acknowledge a couple things here. First of all, Rachel passed in childbirth on the way. They were kind of traveling to, and so she was buried there in that place. She wasn't buried in the family plot, but she up near the cave of Machpelah. She was buried there. And of course, we understand Bethlehem to be the birthplace, Bethlehem, of Yeshua. And it's, in my mind, it speaks to Rachel and her ownership of the children of Israel. Do you remember when Reuben brought the mandrakes to his mother in the field? And Rachel said, "Give me some of those mandrakes." And Leah says, "What? You've already taken the husband, you're going to take the son too." And in that moment, Rachel understands that Leah has likewise been, injured in this struggle for Jacob's affections, and has been injured in this sense of being sort of railroaded into this sham of a marriage. And in that sense, Rachel demonstrates a very unique and powerful form of compassion in understanding Leah and her dilemma. And in that moment, she says, "Okay, you can have Jacob." And Leah goes to Jacob and says, "I have bought you with my son's mandrakes." But what's really happening here? Rachel has effectively traded Jacob and his affections, Leah, for a higher moral position vis-a-vis all the children of Israel, of Jacob. That is to say that even the children of Leah are now going to become the children that she has a great deal of concern for. And of course, in the first place, it's going to be Judah, right? Because the children of Judah includes Yeshua, and Yeshua is the one who is threatened by Herod, the anti-Messiah, and has to flee to Egypt. And so in a sense, and remember, Rachel's prayers are comforted. Rachel's prayers are answered, it says. And this is the sense of it, that what is she praying for? Well, she's praying for the return of the captives, which includes Yeshua out of Egypt, but also includes the people of Israel coming out of Egypt who were enslaved. So effectively what's happening here is in verse 7 of chapter 48, I believe this is serving notice on the future that Rachel will have a sort of cosmic authority to call children of Israel out of Egypt, and to call them forth back from Egypt. Remember, Rachel would have been distraught that Joseph was in Egypt, and so she would have been unconsolable the same way that Jacob was unconsolable. All right, moving on a little bit. There's some more commentary on that if you like. We could discuss further, but let's move on just a little bit. Israel noticed Joseph's sons and says, whose sons are these? And if you're reading and you take the time to really dig into this, these sons are mine statement, and then we've got this, and Israel noticed Joseph's sons and says, whose are these? And it's like, wait, weren't we just here? Didn't we just cover this ground? And Joseph says, these are my sons whom God has given me here. And Yaakov says, I want you to bring them here so that I can bless them. It says Israel's eyes were dim with age. Who else's eyes were dim with age? Well, of course, Isaac said his eyes were dim. And so Joseph brought his sons near, kissed him and embraced him. Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see you again. God has allowed me to see your children too. Joseph brought them out from between his legs and prostrated himself on the ground. Undeniable connection, once again, to the loins, to the seed, bringing him out between his legs. And we don't need to get any more graphic than that. But that's what's happening here. That's the picture that's being painted here. First with the place your hand under my thigh moment, and then here with the children coming out of Joseph to be blessed by the hands of Jacob. Ephraim in his right hand towards Israel's left, Manasseh in his left hand towards Israel's right. But Israel put his right hand and laid it on the head of the younger one, Ephraim, put his left hand on the hand of Manasseh, intentionally crossed his hands, even though Manasseh was the firstborn. There must have been some sort of spiritual insight in that moment, but what a profound statement that at the closing of his life, Israel, Yaakov, Jacob is brought back to the moment when he usurped his older brother as well. And so once again, we have history repeating itself here. He blessed Ephraim and Manasseh, and blessed Ephraim in the greater way with his right hand. Says this, the God in whose presence my fathers Abraham, Isaac lived, the God who has been my own shepherd all my life long to this day. Fascinating statement on the relationship that Jacob must have had with Adonai. We know David had a powerful, passionate relationship with Adonai. We know this because of the Psalms and these sort of things. And of course the descriptions where Adonai says, behold, he's a man after my own heart. But you get a picture here in just this statement of the depth of Jacob's sort of connection to Adonai, his dependence upon Adonai. The God who has been my own shepherd all my life long, the angel who has rescued me from all harm, bless these boys. And then he says this, may they remember who I am and what I stand for, and likewise my fathers Abraham and Yitzchak, who they were and what they stood for, and may they grow into teeming multitudes on the earth. All right. Again, full circle. Coming back to the promise. And remember, this whole scenario, this whole scene takes place in Egypt. They are farther now from the promised land than they've been since Abraham was called out of Ur of the Chaldees. When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on Ephraim's head, it displeased him. He lifted his father's hand to remove it. Don't do it that way. This was the firstborn. The father refused. I know that, my son, I know it. He too will become a people. He too will be great. Nevertheless, the younger will be greater than he. So that's how you put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. And then after this, we have the discussion of the blessings. You can read through these blessings, a lot to unpack from these blessings, a lot that figures highly into our understanding of the dynamics among the brothers. And then in the next chapter, he says, it says this, that Joseph fell on his father's face, wept over him and kissed him, and so forth. And they're going to go and bury him indeed in the field in the cave of Machpelah. I'm going to leave it there with you, but I am going to include one little bit more. And I wasn't prepared to go here, but it's just a fun sort of discussion about what's happening. So what's happening is Jacob has died, and so they're going to go and bury Jacob. And the children are going to stay behind, the women and children, but all the men of their household are going to go up. And so Joseph went up to bury his father, verse 7. With him went all of Pharaoh's servants, the leaders of his household, and the leaders of the land of Egypt, along with the entire household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their little ones, their flocks, and their cattle did they leave behind in the land of Goshen. Moreover, they went up with them both chariots and horsemen. It was a very large caravan. So imagine this. You've got a small army of people leaving Egypt. When do we see that again? Well, we see that again after the Pesach, after Passover, when all the people of Israel again leave. But here we've got an example of them leaving, and they're leaving not just with the people of Israel, they're leaving with some of the Egyptians as well, and including all of Pharaoh's household. So that's an interesting discussion there. So they go up, and it was a very large caravan with chariots and horsemen. Anybody looking on the side at this scenario, at what they saw, they would have thought they were being invaded. And indeed, there are some I don't know if it's Talmud or where it comes from, but there is some discussion of this. And so that's why I said I was going to share this with you, even though I haven't prepared this. But verse 10, when they arrived in the threshing floor in Atad. So what does Atad mean? Atad is the thorns. So it's the threshing floor of thorns, the table of thorns, if you will. Beyond the Yarden, they raised a loud and bitter lamentation, mourning for his father for 7 days. When the local inhabitants, the Canaanese, saw the mourning on the floor of Atad, in other words, again, the floor of thorns, they said, how bitterly the Egyptians are mourning. This is why the place is given the name Avel Mitzrayim, the mourning of Egypt, there beyond the Yarden. And then after this, we have the sons doing as they ordered him to do. They carried him into the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah. But what about this scene that plays out here on the threshing floor of Atad? And some of you have heard me preach on this before, so this may be old news for you. The Valley of Thorns is what this is here, the threshing floor, the table, the stone of thorns. And what the story goes, and again, I don't remember where this is coming from, I think it's Talmud. The story goes that all the inhabitants saw this huge company coming up from Egypt, and they thought they were being invaded. Right here, when it says all the local inhabitants, they saw the mourning. Well, how did the local inhabitants see the mourning, other than they were following the caravan to see what their intentions were? This large caravan had to have looked like an invasion force. And so they saw the mourning on the floor of Atad. In other words, they came to the floor of Atad. According to the Talmudic or the ancient story, goes that when they got there, they saw that Joseph had placed a crown on the chest of Jacob of Israel as he lay there. And the kings and leaders of Canaan came around and saw this great mourning, first of all, and saw all this pomp and circumstance and ceremony, and saw the chariots and the horsemen. Remember what it says later after when Elijah is taken up, and Elisha says, my father, the chariots and the horsemen of Israel. When they saw all these chariots and horsemen of Mitzrayim, of Egypt, and this great sort of entourage. And so the leaders of Canaan came around to see what all the fuss was about. And when they saw this Jacob being mourned so incredibly, that they figured he must have been a king of great importance. And so they all took their crowns down and laid them in a circle around the body of Jacob as he was on the stone table here at the threshold in the Valley of Thorns. Excuse me. Just a moment here if I can, and I will... I'm sorry. I meant to mute that, and I failed to mute that, so that's a failure on my part. Sorry about it. Hopefully I didn't just ruin the audio, but I may have. I may have had, well, some technical issues. We'll check that out in a few minutes. Okay. I want to finish this. Specifically, what do we think of when we think of thorns? Well, obviously, we think of Yeshua and his crown of thorns. But let me ask you, what does a standard crown look like, a king's crown? The king's crown looks like a circle of thorns on the brow of the man, with its spikes and this sort of thing. And most crowns have that sort of motif. They have these kind of spikes. They look like a circle of thorns. And here we have this great honor to the King of Thorns here at the Valley of Thorns that is being paid to him. And it's very much a Messianic sort of prevision, if you will, of Yeshua, who was likewise the King of Thorns, the King with the crown of thorns. And what is it that we are told? That we're going to lay our crowns down in worship to him, that all the leaders of the earth will lay their crowns down in worship to him. So just an interesting picture here at the end of Bereshit, of the future of what is foretold in Yeshua. Okay, going to leave it at that this week. Once again, I enjoy doing these with you. If you have any questions, please reach out to me and let me know. If you would like to send me an email, you'll find my email address below in the description. May Adonai bless you and keep you this week. May he guide you into all goodness and truth. Shalom, shalom.